A new nation is born. The island of Jamaica, for 307 years a British possession, welcomes Princess Margaret and the Earl of Snowdon here to represent Queen Elizabeth at independence ceremonies. The princess is greeted by island dignitaries, including the Prime Minister, Sir William Bustamante, before riding through the streets of Kingston to a roaring reception. The country will be a dominion within the British Commonwealth and thus still maintain ties to all that the princess represents. At the stroke of midnight come impressive ceremonies led by the Prime Minister as the flag of the new nation is proudly raised on high. The island that has been under European domination since it was discovered by Columbus in 1494 embarks on a new era. The nation will be governed by a parliamentary democracy with a Senate and a House of Representatives. And when the reins of government are turned over to Prime Minister Bustamante, Jamaica becomes the first nation in the Western Hemisphere to gain independence since Panama became self-governing in 1903. Jamaica's economy is on more solid ground than other West Indian islands, but the new nation will need continuing aid before she becomes self-sufficient, a new member of the family of democratic nations.
Today's topic is Jamaican independence. Did Jamaica really become independent? No. And what did we get in independence apart from a flag and an anthem? Not a fucking thing. So in 1692, when colonial government was set up, just remember this, they took over in 1665 and named the island Jamaica in 1691. Anyways, the government consisted of a governor, executive council, magistrates court, and the court of admiralty. These courts are what we call today as maritime courts, meaning they have nothing to do with law or common law. The governor was also known as the Lord of the Land, and he was also the commander for the Jamaican militia. The Jamaican militia today is what we know as JDF, the army. The army was and still being used as their personal bodyguards. Now you might say I'm wrong, but ask yourself this. When has a Jamaican soldier ever been deployed to fight a war against another country? Never. All they do is fight Jamaican people by keeping us in order. That's why I call it a personal army. Go to part 2. Welcome back. By 1962, the black population became the superior majority, meaning that there was more black Africans more than any other racial group within the Caribbean at that time. So they know they couldn't continue with the same systems they had oppressing black people. So to appease black citizens and white colonists, the Crown decided to hand over some responsibility to the desegregated local parliament, basically letting some Negroes in. And that's all we got. Don't believe me? This is what the Independence Act of 1962 did not do for us, because I read the act. It did not relinquish the Queen's claim and dominion over the island. She still owns it. It did not return ownership and resources of the land back to the people. We don't own them. It did not restore indigenous rights or birthrights, inheritance. It did not recompensate the wealth that was stolen from the natives during slavery for over 400 years. It did not remove the Queen as head of state. She is still very much there. Remember the time when the government said that they want to remove the Queen and make Jamaica a republic? Find out in part 3. Hello. Like I was saying, the government does not have the authority to remove the Queen as head of state, because they work for her. The Queen owns the island, so the governments are her employees. How can you take something legally from someone who already owns it? So don't believe all that shit. They only do it to get elected. Anyways, it did not rescind the Governor General as Lord of the Land. He still is. Also, he is still the commanding chief of the military. Like, you remember that time when Bruce Golding wanted to send army into Tivoli? He had to ask for permission, and the governor has to issue a state of emergency in order for the army to go in. Bottom line, the government doesn't own the army. The army is still the Jamaican militia and is there for the chief governor to control. Anyways, it did not revoke the birth certificate bonds under citizenry. We still bonded. I'll make a separate video about that. And it did not resolve the debts that was accrued upon the people. This so-called independent nation started off flat broke. No money, debt, broke. Go to part 3. So like I said, Jamaica started out flat broke. And because of this, the government of Jamaica and the Bank of Jamaica, which is owned by the Queen as well, this is in the Bank of Jamaica Act 1960, soon started to borrow large sums of money from predatory multinational lenders, like the International Monetary Fund, you lot know as the IMF, the World Bank, and the Inter-American Development Bank, the IDB. Those banks carry high interest rates and harsh penalty fees, one of them being known as the Structural Adjustment Policy. Keep that in mind. Here is an example of a structural adjustment policy. Jamaica has 3 million people currently living on the island, but only 6 post-service general hospitals. Portmore is the most popular parish on the island and they still don't have a hospital. You know why they don't have a hospital? Because of the structural adjustment policies. Because of this policy, when the IMF lends you money, they can tell you what they want you to spend it on. And they told us explicitly that we can't build no new schools or hospitals. Part 5. Welcome to part 5. This is part of the reason why Jamaica has not built a new school in over 20 years and a hospital in over 30 years. And the debt is why, which is the grip of poverty in Jamaica. Another negative impact that these policies have on Jamaica is to force the country to sell out its resources. We don't own the bauxite, nor the tourism, nor the airlines, or the airports, agriculture, utilities, or the highways. The 6th of this month will be 58 years since our independence, and these policies are still running our country. They dictate everything, from the value of the dollar to the rate of income tax, to what schools they open or what roads get fixed. Today, every half of a dollar that you pay in tax goes towards serving that debt. The other half goes to royalties and other bondholders. Bottom line, your tax doesn't finance Jamaica. The end result is a bankrupt country with a useless currency and a population working to serve a debt that we did not accumulate. And finally, take yourselves over to part 6. Hi, welcome to part 6. There is a group in Washington, D.C. called the Center Course Product for Economy. They published a report in 2015. And in that report, they declared that Jamaica was the most indebted country in the world. That means that out of all 198 countries on earth, we're the only ones who owe so much money relative to the size of our economy. Like, our debt exceeds the country's GDP. Meaning that the debt cannot possibly be repaid because you weren't meant to repay it. You were only meant to have a group of people working to service the debt, not to pay it off. Meaning that Europe still has their fingers, toenails, earlobes, eyelashes, everything in that cute little country we call Jamaica. So please know this, I don't make these videos to offend anyone. I make them to educate and to let people understand that as black people, child, we still struggling, even in our own country. Thank you for watching.
First of all, you go to the private banking system and you see, well, can I get a private banking loan? Because I'm strapped for cash, I need some support, and I'm having trouble paying my overseas bills.
When the private banks won't lend to you, then you've got to do something if you're the leader of a country. And typically what you've got to do is to cut back your spending in some way and try and get more money so that the impact of those cutbacks are not as severe as they otherwise would be. And it's at that point that you generally come to the IMF.
What you really need is to sit down with them and say, look, can I work out a 5-year program? And in the meantime, I'm strapped for some cash, so can you help me up front get out of the cash bind and then put it in the context of a long-term development plan? And they said, no, long-term development is your problem. We are here only to see who do you owe the money to, why are you in a bind, and we'll lend you some money in a very short time frame at full interest rate to get you out of the bind. And they then impose upon you tremendous restrictions in what you can spend.
And then we reach agreement on a set of measures on the budget, on the exchange rate, on monetary policy, on interest rates, on banks, on maybe privatization, and say, yep, we think this could solve your problem.
And you say to them, but if I do it that way, when I finish repaying you, I'm going to be in the bind all over, because this can't solve my problem. They say, not our problem.
The whole idea was to set conditions which the government could not meet. And when the government failed to meet them, you would have to renegotiate a new loan in which the conditions became tighter. So the IMF didn't say, cut out this education program or cut out this health program. What the IMF said is, you must spend only so much money on health and education. And the implication of that was that you had to cut out some programs.
Essentially what the IMF wanted us to do was to devalue our currency. That's the first thing, to make our dollar cheaper.
They needed to expand their exports and diminish their imports. And the best way of doing that is to make foreign currency more expensive.
And since our society is so heavily dependent on imported food, imported fuel, imported books to go to school, imported medicine, when we devalue, the cost of those things we import go up to the citizens. And as a result, the economy today is much more under the control of foreigners, not necessarily through direct ownership, but through the mechanism of debt. In the 1970s, we owed $800 million. By the end of the 1980s, we owed $4 billion. Nowadays, we owe $7 billion. So the debt is rising, and all the time the debt is rising, our capacity to export, to produce, is getting less.